What comes to mind when I say crowdfunding? If your knee-jerk reaction is to say scam, chances are you've probably either had some awful luck, the developer didn't know how to budget properly, or you went on a YouTube binge of notably terrible crowdfunding projects. Unless you only play big-budget AAA games, you've probably played a good crowdfunded game at some point and not realized it. Shovel Knight, Hollow Knight, Undertale, Darkest Dungeon, Risk of Rain, Chivalry Medieval Warfare, Freedom Planet, Faster Than Light, The Banner Saga, and A Hat in Time are just a small sample of the kinds of games that had their roots in crowdfunding. Based on what others have said about crowdfunding, I've been tempted to throw in my own anecdotal evidence to the crowdfunding argument. Which brings us to this video, where I go through my entire crowdfunding history, do the math on how many succeeded and failed, and give in-depth looks at examples from both camps. Because some of these projects failed for very different and at times very strange reasons. Why am I covering successful projects too? Because of what I call the referee principle. Like a referee in any sport, if a crowdfunding project does what it's supposed to and produces a decent product, that's not considered newsworthy. Whereas a failed project will make headlines well past the point that you're sick of hearing about it. For the purpose of this video, I'm defining success or failure based on my expectations for when I back the project, which are usually the following. Did I get what I was promised? And did the game meet my expectations? If the answer to both is yes, it's a success. There's some gray area to this with some games on my list, but we'll get to those as they come. Also note that for this video, I'm only counting successful, fully funded campaigns and focusing exclusively on video game-based projects. I've backed other things such as the Reading Rainbow Kickstarter or the Kung Fury Kickstarter, and I'm leaving those out for this discussion, even though both delivered, so it would actually benefit me to include them, but I won't. Since 2012, I've backed a total of 65 successful crowdfunding campaigns for video games. In that time, by my definition of success, 12 of them failed to meet my standards. And 6 are games that were recently funded and still in active development, so I can't peg them as one or the other. As such, I left them out of this discussion and subtracted them from the 65 campaigns. That means that of the 59 qualifying games I backed, 47 met my definition for success, so my success rate with crowdfunded projects is about 79.6%. Even if the other 6 games all turn out to be flops, that makes the success rate 72.3%, which, if I were a goalkeeper, would be a decent save percentage. But you're not here to listen to me pretend to be a statistician, so let's get some honorable mentions out of the way because otherwise this video is going to be way too long. I mean, it's already going to be long, but this will make it slightly not as long. I can't tell you anything you haven't already heard about this example of someone not understanding how Kickstarter fees work. Among the several other things they didn't understand. Except maybe that when they sent the retro boxes with the instruction manuals that were too big for them, they did send properly sized replacements for free. So add 0.001% to its Metacritic score. Double Fine and Tim Schafer in particular have been hit or miss with crowdfunded games, but with Psychonauts 2 they wound up making not just a good follow-up to the first game, but what apparently became their best-selling game ever. I actually have a lot to say about this, but I'm saving it for its own video. Suffice to say the game wasn't that good and Shaq screwed some people over. And I don't just mean the backers. A niche within a niche, ToeJam and Earl made a crowdfunded comeback with a game primarily based on the first entry in the series, with the Hyperfunk Zone from the second game as an added bonus. I played through it multiple times, including a streamed playthrough with Blonde Guy Gamer, and I was satisfied with it, as well as the poster and the Wise Man keychain that came in the mail. It hurts a little calling this a failure as the game itself is actually quite fun. But thanks to the actions of the head of Lab Zero Games and the subsequent exodus from and implosion of the developer, a laundry list of planned content that hadn't been released yet will not see the light of day. The publisher is fulfilling one of the more pricey backer rewards in the Ajna statue, but not the planned physical version for certain platforms and regions. It's like my parents would say, I'm not mad, just disappointed. Once Koji Igarashi was freed from game development Alcatraz, aka Konami, he came out swinging with a campaign for his own not Castlevania Symphony of the Night title, Bloodstained: Ritual of the Night. It got so much funding, it spawned a spin-off title called Bloodstained: Curse of the Moon, aka not Castlevania III: Dracula's Curse. The initial game was received well, and the spin-off was received so well that Curse of the Moon 2 became a thing. Because of the $5.5 million in backing, tons of stretch goals for extra content were hit, so many in fact that the game still doesn't have all of it. Some were part of the initial launch, but extra modes like Boss Rush, Speedrun, Randomizer, Boss Revenge, and Classic have all been added over time, along with extra playable characters. Since they delivered on both the main game and the spin-off, fulfilled everything I was promised at my backer tier, and have thus far held up their promise of not working on premium paid DLC until all the promised content is finished, it gets a thumbs up from me. Fear Effect is already a polarizing game on its own, so trying to bring it back after 17 years was going to have its rough edges under the best circumstances. That said, Fear Effect Sedna did almost none of the things that garnered the original game a cult following. It adopted a different camera, different combat system, different style of gameplay, different/worse writing and story, and as such, got a different/worse reception. Hailing from South Africa, the Bischoff brothers, particularly Chris, a 3D artist, set out to make a 2D isometric point-and-click sci-fi horror game, and Stasis was the result. In addition to the game being received well, they hit a goal to create a free add-on title in the same universe called Kane. And aside from crowdfunding another adventure title, Beautiful Desolation, Stasis Bone Totem was also crowdfunded and is currently in development. Now then, I'm going to start with a game that almost classified as a failure, but redeemed itself in the end. After a couple successful crowdfunding campaigns that delivered Wasteland 2 and Torment: Tides of Numenera, InXile Entertainment put forth a campaign to fund an addition to the old Bard's Tale series, titled The Bard's Tale 4: Barrows Deep, and upon its release, it was a bug-infested mess. I cannot put into words just how many bugs, both minor and game-breaking, Bard's Tale 4 had on release. It's like trying to count the grains of sand on a beach. The reason this isn't in the failure group is that, aside from getting everything I was told I'd receive, the developers took the backlash on the chin and set to work on making things right, releasing a series of patches to fix all kinds of issues, making gameplay tweaks, and adding requested features. It's one of the only times I've seen a development roadmap that was actually followed. 11 months after its release, the original Bard's Tale 4 was delisted from stores, and Bard's Tale 4 Director's Cut took its place, a version with all the quality of life updates and bug fixes applied to the original, in addition to another area to explore, more enemies to fight, and new items to acquire. This version was given out for free to those who already had the original and then patched another few times for good measure. It's still got its bugs, but they're the charming, goofy-looking kind, and not the, oh crap, I need to reload my save and do multiple fights over kind. If the fact that I still stream this game now and then isn't an indication, I was pleased with the results. Now then, on to failure number 1. The third video game project I ever backed was Soul Saga, a project from Mike Disaster Cake Gale that was advertised as a classic JRPG with a couple unique touches. Even though only the absolute basic elements of combat and overworld exploration were shown off, the very anime theme song and casting some recognizable names for the Kickstarter trailer helped attract interest.
Wait, what? The World Eater? But that's how your father died! You're not serious, are you?
Sure am. This is my chance to prove I'm stronger than my old man by doing the one thing he couldn't.
And yes, Voice acting was a stretch goal. The game had a relatively ambitious target of $60,000, but it raised nearly $200,000 in mid-2013, hitting stretch goals for tons of in-game content extras, airship exploration and combat, because someone was a Skies of Arcadia fan, I guess, voice acting, and console ports for the PS4, PS Vita, and Wii U. Yes, this project is old enough that it offered ports to the Vita and the Wii U. There was a fair amount of hype around the project to the point that nerdcore rapper Richie Branson produced a song about it called Soulful Saga, based on one of the game's tracks.
Passion grows hotter, that's why I spit a flow similar to cold lava. Philosopher, kicking that knowledge with no bother, all in the name of fulfilling my soul saga.
Not long after the successful campaign, Soul Saga was greenlit on Steam. Remember Steam Greenlight? Remember when that was a thing? And Mike went about, in his own words, quote, revamping the game, unquote. Hiring new artists, changing character designs, and removing some old posts and videos showing off things like how combat worked because it was going to change. This was a major red flag to several backers, who were concerned the game that would wind up being made wouldn't resemble the one they wanted to support. Then the characters were redesigned again, which the backers didn't like. Again. Amidst an update where Mike lamented how the project lost time and money from freelance artists flaking out on him. It took 3 redesigns for Elise, the female lead, to resemble something the backers liked, though many still didn't like it as much as the original. Imagine the time and money that would have been saved by not trying to dramatically redesign the characters over and over. Development continued even as Mike had a ruptured disc in his back and put off getting surgery to fix it. By the way, never do this. Get your body right, get healthy, and then get back to making weeaboo games. Even as about $15,000 in pledges were dropped due to how certain parts of the project were handled, Mike not only implemented the story of a character from a stretch goal the campaign did not reach, he made it the focus of one of the game's beta releases. Time passed and the game's 3D animator left due to taking on a new job. The beta would get updated a few times, and then the combat system would be reimagined to function as team-based instead of turn-based. The inventory system was replaced by a lunchbox system, and the game's overall look seemed to be too much of a departure from what was initially presented for some. In spite of its issues, development continued into 2015, with Mike frequently asking backers for feedback and implementing it into each beta build. He also made it so the first Soul Saga game, yes, this is a thing now, would focus on the main characters when they're younger. Yet another change in the game's presentation and structure. Then a new version of Unity came out, which Soul Saga was adapted to, which set back development even more. I should clarify that not every change made to the game was received negatively. There were a number of minor changes and a few more significant changes that were received positively. However, the sheer number of changes made, particularly for a game with not just a fair-sized scope, but a scope that kept hitting the reset button, all for a game with one guy doing the programming, writing, and directing. You're probably already imagining how this ends as I'm speaking, so let's fast forward a bit. It is now 2018. Personal issues would loom large, as Mike not only got evicted from his apartment, but unfortunately went through a divorce in which he was forced to move again. After eventually realizing he was taking on way too much work himself for such an ambitious and regularly changing project, he decides to launch the game in early access on Steam, which was delayed because of a Unity engine error that prevented both playing the game and working on it in Unity's dev kit. When it was both released and playable, it became apparent to everyone that the game was now more of a roguelite than any sort of tribute to classic RPGs, one which included clunky airship sections where the player constantly gets pinballed around by flying blue gator things. By the way, that drains your health. Absurd difficulty scaling. A story that's basically a placeholder if the early access page is anything to go by. Placeholder shop systems. Yes, the released game is still in flux for how it will play, and little or no explanation for anything, especially not how combat works. I actually got the hang of how to time my attacks for certain damage bonuses using the automatic wheel on the right, but at the same time this is such a radical departure from what was initially proposed that it's not surprising a lot of people soured on it. There's still a chance for this project to redeem itself, as from a cursory glance at the developer's Discord, Disaster Cake is still somewhat active and claims to be taking feedback from the current build. In fact, when I messaged him to ask about switching my console code for a Steam key, he responded within a few days with a key, on top of links to the other things at my backers tier, and the soundtrack, which wasn't at my backers tier. He also included a list of what he was working on, an invite to his community Discord channel, and a thank you for the support. I mean, that's appreciated, but for now, it's hard to classify this as anything but a failure. Oh, for God's sake, man, you've got to stop reinventing the wheel. I can all but guarantee you have no idea what this is. Anthony Nichols had an idea for a pixelized survival stealth game based around an office building being raided by a private security/mercenary group from a rival business, with one of the pencil pushers trying to avoid all of them and escape. With the game about half finished, he posted a Kickstarter campaign with a modest goal of $800, most of which would be for covering fees from Steam Greenlight, establishing an LLC, acquiring Mac OS X for creating a Mac port, and of course, Kickstarter fees. After a year and a half of regular updates, sometimes more than one in a month, the game had a website, a private developer blog, a Steam Greenlight page, multiple beta builds for testing, and finally launched on Steam for PC alongside a Mac port. I received everything promised at my tier, which included designing an NPC, and the game itself was surprisingly decent. I'm usually not one for stealth games, especially not ones this difficult, but I wound up enjoying it. Unlike a certain other project. Wrestling video games of the late 90s, particularly ones running on the Aki engine like the WCW vs. NWO titles and No Mercy, are regarded as some of the most entertaining wrestling games ever made. So it's no surprise some developers have tried to recapture their magic. Enter Pro Wrestling X. Starting as an idea in the mind of Dave Wisnowski in the early to mid-2000s, it led to a project that was funded in less than 2 days in March of 2014. It raised more than twice its $6,400 Canadian goal, or about $5,000 US, hitting the stretch goals to add a massive cage and weapons to matches before finally raising about $13,600 US. If that goal seems unusually low to you, then I should note that the initial failed attempt to fund this game had a goal of $75,000 US. The successful campaign said the biggest tech hurdles were out of the way this time, but more on that later. The description for the game indicated modest goals for gameplay, based on the amount of grapples, strikes, submissions, etc., and with the project lead saying they added a veteran programmer to their team, the estimated time for the early access version of the game was a mere 3 months later in June of 2014. Instead, it would launch on early access in late November of that year. Early access keys to backers, however, were not handed out until March of the following year. Nearly 8 years later, the game is still in early access, and physical rewards didn't start shipping until... that's hard to say because the penultimate update in January of 2018 said rewards were starting to ship, and the last update in March of 2019 was Dave apologizing profusely for dropping the ball on the rewards and starting to ship them out. No idea if those actually reached anyone. Meanwhile, people who played the releases of Pro Wrestling X often found them to have previous content repeatedly removed and put back in. You know, that thing WWE games do between releases. On top of being riddled with bugs, to the point that some matches became unplayable and or flat out impossible to win. And even if you do win, Often the game will just ignore that and say that you lost. Aside from that, updates are sparse on the Kickstarter. A game-specific newsletter and Facebook page are where most updates happen, and from them it was apparent that new staff would come and go over time, just like certain moves or even gameplay features. Hell, there's a Facebook post from last June celebrating that multiplayer is back. It was gone by the time I played it again. Meanwhile, the newsletter, which you can't sign up for anymore, stopped hitting my inbox years ago. I'd like to read you an excerpt from the last one I received. Wrestling Gamers United newsletter number 884, dated March 25th, 2019, while showing footage of Pro Wrestling X. 2 hours I spent on the phone with our lead programmer. I don't know if anyone in the history of PWX crew members has ever had a more insane combination of talent, creativity, and passion for Pro Wrestling X. So why am I frustrated? Because this guy is cranking on this massive new update that will finally get us hour of early access, but he's limited to spare minutes, nights, and weekends. He's not a kid living in his mom's basement, he's got bills. We're both chomping at the bit to unleash him full-time on Pro Wrestling X development. Just a month or so full-time and Pro Wrestling X is 100% running on the latest engine and out of early access and in full 1.0 release. He's willing to leave his demanding day job if we can just keep a roof over his head while he goes hard on Pro Wrestling X. For every problem, there is at least one solution. Yeah, there's still a faint chance this game might have a full-fledged release given that it's not completely dead, but as things stand right now, nearly a decade and over $13,000 later, this was/is a letdown. Unlike this next game. Remember Mutant League Football for the Genesis? Well, the man behind that game, Michael Medheim, resurfaced on Kickstarter in 2013 with a pitch for Mutant Football League. As an aside, I had to proofread this part of the script way too many times to make sure that I did not mix up Mutant League Football and Mutant Football League. It was built upon the engine for another football game that had some clear Tecmo Bowl inspiration and sported some RPG elements to improve the players on a team. The problem is, those are two things that are decidedly not like the original Mutant League Football. When the initial campaign fell over $600,000 short of its goal, Michael went back to the drawing board in between other projects and came back in early 2017 with a pre-alpha build for the new Mutant Football League, playing more like a mix between the original Mutant League Football and NFL Blitz. Along with a much lower goal of $60,000 thanks to the amount of development already completed, the project raised nearly $140,000 and hit a slew of stretch goals for more fields, species, teams, dirty tricks, the ability to bribe and or kill the referee, and a full-fledged season mode. The game delivered on all of these, even adding some late 90s, early 2000s nostalgia by getting Tim Kitzrow as one of the commentators. He of NBA Jam, Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey, and NFL Blitz fame.
It's game day here in New Orleans, Louisiana, and the Zombies fans are really fired up, mostly due to the flamethrowers the SWAT team has used against them in the parking lot. Oh, an awful kick. Good thing his entire family came to the game to see him play today. Must be real proud. Stay with us for the halftime show, brought to you by our friends at Monsatan Industries. We make genetically altered frankenfood you'll have fun trying to identify.
It's maintained a very positive rating on Steam and even got a couple award nominations when it came out. And since I got everything I was promised, including beta access, alpha access, a digital art book, and this tester t-shirt, it's a total success by my standards. As for this next game though, it didn't even deliver a playable build. Not even a demo. As the second crowdfunding project of Czech developers Dreadlocks Limited, Ghost Theory's goal was to be a first-person horror game set across several real-life haunted locations, in which the player controlled a clairvoyant ghost hunter who used both modern and archaic equipment to search for apparitions. In a way, it was like a single-player Phasmophobia before Phasmophobia, particularly since it was being developed to work in VR. It fell way short of its £100,000 goal, but it succeeded in a second campaign 6 months later, where it hit its more modest £50,000 goal. However, as is written on their Kickstarter page, quote, £50,000 is only about 17% of the expected cost of the game without the stretch goal features. That's not how much the game will cost, not even if we eliminate all of the planned game features. Reaching this target is the very minimum we need to keep production running and save this project from being cancelled. In case it's not apparent already, relaunching campaigns with more modest goals to achieve funding of any amount is actually a pretty common practice, but it's also a very dangerous one if the funding is barely more than the said bare minimum. If anything doesn't go according to plan, it could potentially sink the project. Things such as the investor who helped with their previous game backing out on Ghost Theory a few months after its successful Kickstarter campaign, switching game engines, namely from Unity to CryEngine, and having to relearn how everything works specifically to try and win a cash prize in a game dev contest, then being named an unofficial winner, and being told that actually there were no cash prizes for the winners. Or how about having to work on other smaller indie projects to cover the costs of keeping the studio running and paying staff? They used the profits from a prior release to help fund Ghost Theory's development, but that was only a temporary measure until they could secure funding from a publisher, which never happened, or got approval for Crytek or EU art and development funding, which never happened. Money got so tight that more than half the development team had to leave, but they still offered refunds to anyone who wanted to pull their Kickstarter support, at least when they could still afford them. Then the bank they would receive profits from abruptly stopped sending them any money because it was in US dollars, and they stopped dealing in that currency with no notice. Pretty much everything that could have gone wrong short of the studio burning to the ground happened, and eventually, after more than 2 years, Dreadlocks posted their final update, saying that after porting some already existing games to new markets in an effort to pay off their debts, quote, "The studio has to make a certain amount of money in January from its Christmas sales to level its debts. If not, it will be bankrupted and closed down. It's hard to describe how it feels. Waiting for the numbers. There is nothing more we can do." Dreadlocks would mostly just post about their already existing games when they went on sale after that, and not a word has been said about Ghost Theory ever since. What makes this particular project so disappointing is not just the double-edged sword of hitting a low funding goal but being completely screwed if any other revenue streams dry up. Nor is it the series of unfortunate events that followed. It's that the studio already showed they could both develop a decent game and deliver on a crowdfunding campaign. Remember how I said Ghost Theory was the second crowdfunding project from Dreadlocks? Dex was the first one. At a time when Dreadlocks consisted of 8 members and mostly just worked on mobile games, they raised more than double their £14,000 goal in late 2013 to create something radically different. A hand-drawn, side-scrolling cyberpunk RPG revolving around a strange lady that a rich and powerful organization wants dead at damn near any cost. It was made more ambitious by hitting a stretch goal which added more areas to the game. Even though that goal does seem pretty low, they apparently got extra funding through the Free the Games Fund provided by Ouya, where their Kickstarter funding was matched in exchange for being an Ouya console exclusive for a certain amount of time. If you're wondering how that ended, I direct you to this image from update number 45. Still, Dreadlocks did secure funding for development without having to make a lot of cuts, and that's reflected in the final product. While updates were infrequent at times, they did push out early alpha and beta builds to backers, And I know that for sure because not only did I play them, but I did a video on one of those alpha releases for the River City Gamers channel. A year and a half after funding, the game was out. A couple months later, the game re-released as an enhanced version with more bug fixes and quality of life updates, such as manual saves, better enemy AI, and improved menu layouts. The art style was what got my interest, but the way the game played held my attention. It's one of those games that advertises using different builds to progress through the game, and I actually did that by focusing heavily on either stealth, firearm proficiency, hand-to-hand combat, or hacking across multiple playthroughs. Multiple playthroughs meaning, yes, I enjoyed decks, in addition to the art book and the world map that I got. While more recent reviews have been mixed, it's largely maintained a very positive rating on Steam overall. There is, however, an unfortunate catch to all of this. A few months after Dex released, Jan Yurkovsky, the game's lead designer, died suddenly at the age of 26 from kidney failure. One can only imagine what else he might have accomplished had he not passed away at such a young age. Look, I don't have a good transition for this, so just show the next failed project. What the hell happened here? Project Scissors, aka NightCry, is a 3D point-and-click horror title in the same vein as the Clock Tower games. Appropriately enough, the game's director was Hifumi Kono, the director of the first two Clock Tower games. Complementing him was Takashi Shimizu, director of the Ju-On films, Masahiro Ito, who did art and/or monster design for several Silent Hill entries, and Michiru Yamane, composer for nearly a dozen Castlevania titles, among other veterans in the game, film, and/or animation industries. And with all this talent behind it, NightCry met its $300,000 funding goal in 2015. Less than 2 days before the campaign ended. Over the course of the next year, development went at a steady pace, though it hit a roadblock when it came to voicing the characters. Japanese players were hoping for a Japanese dub, but Kono said he envisioned the game as having just English voices in the style of Resident Evil. And saying you want your voice work to be based on Resident Evil in any form should have been a massive red flag. Oddly enough, Barry Burton's voice actor in the first Resident Evil was part of NightCry's cast.
That's right. I'm Vigo Baratsov, the owner of this ship. We met in the cargo hold, Rooney.
Just take a look at this!
Because it wasn't part of the initial plan, Kono and company went to Campfire, a Japanese crowdfunding site, to get the funding to make the Japanese dub happen, and then implemented both dubs across all versions. When they showed off the game at a convention in Japan, one of the comments they decided to highlight for the backer update was, quote, "I like the pacing very much, but it is a little difficult to understand where to go. Overall, a very good experience." Would this be a harbinger of things to come? Well, not the good experience part. NightCry was designed as a mobile title first and then adapted to PC, which is reflected in how the game looks and plays in several regards, not the least of which being the smartphone you use to browse social media to find puzzle clues and post help messages. Yes, really. Oh, by the way, the mobile version of NightCry, it was released on November 0, 2000 never. That, however, was not the biggest issue. Many felt it embodied several of the worst aspects of classic point-and-click games, like not being able to pick up an item until after talking to certain people, even if that made absolutely no sense, and sometimes having to talk to them several times to pick up an item. Not being able to leave a room because of having to interact with something completely unrelated to what's going on more than once, as in up to 4 or 5 times. Completely nonsensical puzzle solutions that should get you killed very easily, but are instead necessary to progress through the game. Not being able to move properly because the click-based movement, combined with the regularly changing camera angles, can send a character moving in the opposite direction you want them to very easily. Not being able to pick up an item because it's part of a pixel hunt. The Scissor Walker, the game's main enemy, being easily scared off by common items such as fire extinguishers and pepper spray, or being easily outmaneuvered. Getting killed because of not doing some completely arbitrary task. Getting killed for not button mashing fast enough in panic events. Or getting killed for doing something you're supposed to do. No, you did not mishear that last statement. As for the rewards, I just got the game, but some backers who paid to be characters in the game wound up having their voices used for these characters. However, from an ironic standpoint, some people liked the janky, unnatural character animations, the goofy cutscenes, and the bad voice acting. And I must emphasize, liked ironically.
Are you all right? You look very pale.
Are you alive?
What?
I don't intend to beg for your forgiveness. I'm going to go on with my life.
Seriously? If we fall, we'll be seafood.
Would you like to stay here? I'm going down.
Wait, I'm coming too.
All right, let's go.
This is what happens when someone who's not fluent in or does not speak English directs English-speaking actors. Not long after its release, allegations were thrown around about the developers paying for positive reviews on Steam, as a series of them came from accounts which all logged the same amount of playtime, reviewed all the same games prior to NightCry, and all were pretty poorly written, though the developers denied this and the reviews were eventually removed. The game currently sits at mixed on Steam, with 60% of reviewers liking it, so it seems like it found its niche. But the overall reviews from around its release were not so kind to it, and for good reason. In case it's not already apparent, I am not part of that 60%, because some parts of the old point-and-click game design are best left dead and buried. As for something that did appeal to me, I back the games made in Africa. Say hello to Kiro'o Games, a studio based out of Yaoundé, Cameroon. Their idea was to start making video games based on African legends and mythos, starting with Aurion, Legacy of the Kori-Odan, a hand-drawn 2D action RPG heavily inspired by the older Tales of games. You play an African prince named Enzo, who was overthrown on his wedding day by his brother-in-law. He then has to travel the world to become stronger and gain favor with the rulers of other territories. Then he can return home and claim his rightful throne. The campaign itself had a goal of 40,000 euros and would end up raising almost 50,000 in late 2015, hitting no stretch goals in the process. Like Pro Wrestling X, the idea for the game was formed in the mid-2000s, way before the studio existed. But the people behind Kiro'o Games repeatedly updated their vision of what the game could be and landed on a concrete, cohesive plan for it. The earliest version of Aurion was an RPG Maker title that used assets from several other games, and it simply kept evolving, adding new gameplay elements, getting its own sprites, and eventually moving off RPG Maker entirely to become its own thing. The game was greenlit before the campaign even started, and after a couple updates every other month, Aurion launched on Steam in April of 2016, a mere 6 months later. I only backed it for a copy of the game, and for a studio putting out its first official game, one that's relatively ambitious in what it wants to be, it's pretty fun. And even when not considering that, it's still pretty fun. Other players apparently thought the same, as the game still has a very positive rating on Steam. It's far from perfect, particularly with visuals, some of which come off as having that cheaper mobile game aesthetic, or how certain things like the tutorials would still appear in French for the English language option. However, the story remains engaging as both Enzo and his wife Heroine get put through the ringer. Combat is pretty flexible, allowing mixing and matching of Aurionic states to unlock new abilities, and Enzo is easy to control for the platforming sections the game throws at him. What helped Aurion was that they performed some regular patches to not just fix bugs, but address certain language translation issues and even implemented some player feedback, such as adding a way to skip the dialogue sequence at the beginning of the game to get to the action faster. Following the game, Kiro'o launched a graphic novel based on its story, as well as a mobile puzzle game, Aurion Kajuta Gems Fighter, and an unrelated life sim mobile game called The Elite of Boa. But as it turns out, Kiro'o's ambitions are bigger than making games. They're involved in a chain of pop culture-based bistros called Kiro Chop, offer business consultation services under Kiro'o Ubuntu, and are creating an Africa-specific mobile monetization platform. Look, just don't turn into the African version of EA, please? Please? I'm asking nicely. Welcome to a game that spawned from simply asking, what if? In this case, what if there were an RPG where the heroes did their usual thing of ransacking an NPC's house and accidentally leading the villains into town, but you then played as the NPC trying to get out of this crappy situation? That's You Are Not the Hero, which started as a simple mini-game with fourth wall breaking humor and grew into a project that raised over $90,000, or almost 8 times its funding goal, in late 2013, then raised some additional funds through PayPal and Humble widgets on the game's site, which went down some time ago. I know what you're thinking looking at this footage, and yes, this game runs on the RPG Maker engine, specifically RPG Maker VX Ace, the same thing I used to make a pre-alpha build of River City Gamers the game. I'm not saying you can't make a good game with RPG Maker, as games like To the Moon, Yume Nikki, and Lisa the Painful were made with it. But even though VX Ace allows the backend code to be modified, it still has its limitations. Even so, this game got a surprising amount of press, including a 2-page interview feature in Retro Magazine. It was greenlit on Steam before the campaign ended, and after the campaign ended, the updates were rolling in within days of each other. The first major hiccup came when a month of development and a few $100s were lost due to trying to get a drawing tablet to one of the artists, only for said tablet to turn out to be defective and the warranty to not cover their situation. Eventually, the game's lead programmer/director, Don Manalili, would post a couple self-described rants about the game's progress, turnover in staff, and the game's budget. He mentioned going through 14 different pixel artists, 7 concept artists, 5 programmers, 4 bust artists, and a musician, and how $23,000 from the campaign went to covering taxes, Kickstarter money is considered taxable income, on top of the $9,000 plus that went to Kickstarter and Amazon fees. Those numbers seem unusually high, so either the money wasn't spent fast enough to be written off as expenses, remember, funding ended in November and this money would be taxable when the year ended, or the numbers were embellished and I don't know which one it was. Don decided to release You Are Not the Hero on Steam Early Access in June of 2015 to try and generate some supplementary funds to aid development, even though he acknowledged that some backers didn't like this idea because, quote, "The Early Access program is full of unfinished half-assed games." When this game hit Early Access, it only had 3 out of the game's 6 planned chapters and was missing several features, like the world map and shopkeeping. Development was slowed by Don moving 3 different times and then getting engaged. I don't know if you've ever planned a wedding before, but it's close to game development in terms of the amount of planning involved. In addition, it seems like in his turnover of the crew, he dropped Drew Ritter, a programmer for the game. I say that because when I found Drew's LinkedIn profile, it said he stopped working with Don in 2016. Couple that with conversion to an updated game engine and development slowed to a crawl. Still, Don set a hard release date of March 2016 for the game's full release. Only to get dragged into working at the family business and, oh yeah, there was that whole getting married thing. In late 2016, Don committed to making bi-weekly updates on development. And this lasted 4 updates, not all of which were bi-weekly. He even posted this handy-dandy progress chart so people could see what was left to work on. For reference, this chart is from the second bi-weekly update in January 2017. This other chart is from the last update, posted in July 2018. showing that the main questline of the game wasn't finished. Meanwhile, the early access build still only has 3 out of 6 chapters implemented, runs as well as a horse on rollerblades, can't go full screen without badly downscaling the resolution, and is loaded with placeholder text and blank character portraits. It also has a serious dialogue option, which comes off less serious and more joyless. The platforming elements is a nice touch, as is sprinting and being able to move diagonally, but it's often hard to tell when the character will stop moving at an edge or simply fall off of it. And the quote-unquote battle system is a glorified QuickTime event. No thanks. I should also mention that the library capsule icon for the game looks like this. Too bad this message isn't anywhere on the store page where it might be useful. Some of the user reviews claim the developer used the backer money to pay for their wedding, but I couldn't find any evidence of that outside of said claims. And the timetable for the wedding versus the game's campaign and eventually hitting early access goes against that, as the majority of the funds would have already been spent. I tried reaching out to a couple people who worked on the game, but neither of them responded. Presumably they just want to leave this behind. As a little twist of the knife, the HD wallpapers and digital instruction booklet I was supposed to get, 2 of the easiest rewards to deliver, they never showed up. While You Are Not the Hero is as good as dead, since Don is so removed from his socials he doesn't even post on his Facebook page anymore, aka the thing he used the most, its concept would appear in another RPG Maker-based game called An NPC's Odyssey, which as far as I can tell is a finished game that was released for the Switch. And that brings me to another RPG you can find on the eShop. Having already worked on Breath of Death 7, Cthulhu Saved the World, which was another Kickstarter game, and Rainslick Precipice of Darkness 3 and 4, the guys behind Zeboyd Games crowdfunded Cosmic Star Heroine, a Japanese-style turn-based RPG built off of the Unity engine, which also threw in some cutscenes heavily inspired by games on the Sega CD and the Turbo Duo. This is one of the only ways that taking inspiration from the Sega CD can be considered a good thing. With the campaign launched at the beginning of October 2013, it was fully funded in about 12 days, hitting its $100,000 goal. It would end up raising just over $132,000. With no stretch goals announced, they said the extra money would be used for polish, extra non-essential features, and bolstering the soundtrack. The game's slated release date on the Kickstarter page was December of 2014. Zeboyd even listed their previous games on the campaign page along with their development times, as if to say that the release date was not just possible, but likely. And when December 2014 came around, Cosmic Star Heroine was in its alpha phase. That's not to say that they weren't working on it. Updates to the Kickstarter campaign happened at least once a month, often more than that, and included screenshots, soundtrack previews, reports from events where builds of the game were shown off, and user feedback, such as input on menu designs or even voting on designs for new playable characters. In the lead up to its release, like You Are Not the Hero, it was also featured in Retro Magazine. Hell, it was featured in the same issue on the page right after You Are Not the Hero's article. Because the universe has a weird sense of humor like that. Eventually, they committed to a final, rather vague release date of June, July, or August 2016. And when August 2016 came around, Cosmic Star Heroine was in its beta phase. The game did finally launch in April of 2017, though not without issues. Anyone who got the game through PSN did not receive the finished game, but rather an old beta build that was never intended for public distribution. Codes for this version were held back until they could get it fixed, which they did, less than 24 hours later. When it did finally release, the game was received fairly well. It still holds a very positive rating on Steam, and its other releases scored in the mid to high 7s on average. And having played it, I can see why. Rather than the bog-standard turn-based RPG, the battle system here places an emphasis on not using the same attacks over and over, particularly through the style system, where the higher the style meter is, the more effective attacks become, in addition to a slew of unique status effects and maneuvers that play off of other party members. The game has virtually no grinding and rarely any dull moments, with party members swapping in and out regularly and keeping the plot moving without getting bogged down in a novel's worth of text boxes. It can also be adjusted on the fly in terms of things like movement speed and difficulty, and the soundtrack is among my favorites for RPGs. Props to Hyperduck Soundworks for all the work they put into it. The game received a series of patches, though they went up slower for the console versions, because they had to get permission from the people who made the consoles, and it's an unnecessarily long process. It would take several months for physical rewards to be prepped and sent out, including a physical version of Cosmic Star Heroine distributed in partnership with Limited Run Games. I got everything I was told I would get, including the game, the soundtrack, and all of Zeboid's previous games, as well as the soundtrack to one of them. So yeah, Cosmic Star Heroine wound up being worth the wait. Which brings me to a game people are still waiting on. This one is just bizarre. It's the one video game I backed where I received all of the physical and digital rewards, but not the complete game. Drift Stage wowed many at first with its unique look, drift-based arcade racing, and a soundtrack that somehow managed to be both energizing and soothing at the same time. It nearly doubled its $30,000 goal in early 2015, and a steady stream of updates followed, including multiple alpha builds, reward fulfillment, the implementation of a car editor, and online multiplayer testing. Then the updates started to go up several months apart. The game's official website went down and was eventually replaced by a blog about go-karting based out of Louisiana. It wasn't until the game's artist, Charles Blanchard, aka Delco Duck, posted on the game's Steam forum in 2018 that it became apparent what was going on. Drift Stage had three main figures involved: Myron, who provided the music, Delco Duck, who created the art assets, and Chase Pettit, who was the programmer and co-creator. According to Delco Duck, Chase would fall out of contact for months at a time, and the only thing he did say was that he was too busy to work on Drift Stage. As he's the only programmer and has control over the dev studio and the game's code, only he could hand off development to someone else, which he didn't do. It looks like once the funds for Drift Stage's development started to dry up, he lost interest pretty quickly. Delco Duck summed up Chase's actions as follows, quote, "The fact of the matter is, Chase Pettit abandoned the project in a very unstable and difficult to manage state over the course of years, giving only false hope in the form of vague text messages like, 'I'll have something in a week.' That week never came. He had given countless vapid excuses for his actions, ranging from the death of his grandmother to working in Mexico, none of which he supplied any real evidence of, or for that matter displayed any remorse or urgency towards the state of the game, or the concerns of the backers. Then, in the summer of 2019, a non-Chase related blow was dealt to Drift Stage. Delco Duck explained that a Chilean studio decompiled one of their game builds and tried to impersonate the dev team. Oddly enough, there's a post in the same thread from a Chilean developer about an iOS game they made which looks a lot like Drift Stage but apparently plays more like Outrun than a straight up traditional racing game. Apparently that got Chase's attention, and he allegedly sent messages to that developer saying, quote, "Anger and spite are huge motivators, and the existence of your clone has filled me with white-hot rage. I'm going to do whatever it takes to make sure that Drift Stage is completed and a success, so that I can take that success and leverage it to shut down your pitiful clone factory." Chase committed to making bi-weekly updates to Drift Stage, and as of my writing this, he has made a grand total of 0 bi-weekly updates. Suddenly Don's 4 updates for You Are Not the Hero doesn't seem as bad. A thread on the game's forum popped up where people posted other retro-inspired racing games to play that finished development, unlike Drift Stage, since it never had an official public release of any kind. Delco Duck would try to reach out to publishers and anyone who could help with development, but didn't seem to find any willing suitors. In February of 2022, he gave another somber update. Quote, I'm working to release the current version on Steam. That's all I can really do at the moment. It's not publicly available, you need a key. The legal conflict caused by the programmer and musician abandoning the game has made any updates almost impossible. It was also very time-consuming, stressful, and expensive to secure the rights and use of the code. It's been too long, and there won't be any updates to this version of the game. It's my hope having the latest version available will lead to the game's acquisition. Said build includes a number of issues, not the least of which being the incomplete soundtrack, there being only 3 tracks to race on, and the lap counter not working for 2 of them. Also, one of the tracks can easily be driven through without drifting at all, which I thought was the point of this game. There's still the option to create custom paint jobs for the cars and apparently multiplayer. Obviously, I couldn't find anyone to play with, but it's still little more than a demo build. Delco Duck would get the chance to see a different project to the finish line in Skyrogue, but Drift Stage remains in a seemingly eternal limbo. As I was editing this video, a breakthrough happened. After years of struggling, Delco Duck managed to get the most recent build of the game released publicly as an early access title on Steam, as well as the complete soundtrack as a DLC purchase. This was mainly done to finally get keys to people who pre-ordered the game and the soundtrack, but it does mean that a version of Drift Stage is finally available to everyone, even if it's incomplete. I'm still not calling this a successful project, but at least Drift Stage isn't a catastrophic failure anymore and it has shown some signs of life. Although speaking of drift, Alex Preston is the key guy behind Heart Machine, an indie studio named after Alex's struggles with congenital heart disease, which also served as the inspiration for his first game, Hyper Light Drifter. Described as a blending of the best parts of A Link to the Past and Diablo in its campaign, the main character struggles to find a cure for a mysterious and deadly illness, a clear allegory for Preston's personal struggles. Alex set out with a fairly modest goal of $27,000 to make the game, but its unique look and promising trailer spread like wildfire and got a ton of attention. So, how much did he actually raise?
That won't be much, will it?
Oh yes, it's about
$645,000. To give an idea of how quickly the hype permeated through the internet, Alex started the campaign on September 12, 2013, and by the time he woke up the next day, he'd raised $42,000. The funds were coming in so fast, he couldn't announce stretch goals fast enough to keep up, having to post campaign updates 7 times in the first day to answer questions and keep up with the level of support he was receiving. In the end, 18 stretch goals were hit, including extra game content and modes, more platforms to port the game to, and hiring programmers, animators, and composers to help with the game. 3 of those platforms were the Ouya, PS Vita, and Wii U, which... yeah, none of those happened for varying reasons. While originally set for a mid-2014 release, the much more massive scope of the game pushed back the release date significantly. The development team also had a bit of a perfectionist mindset, largely sticking to the old Shigeru Miyamoto quote about how a delayed game is eventually good, but a rushed game is forever bad. There was another thing that hampered Hyper Light Drifter's ability to release sooner: Alex's health. Due to his medical condition, he physically couldn't go full nose to the grindstone or try to crunch his development, particularly not when his condition got worse, and he needed to go to the hospital and have a procedure carried out to install an artificial valve in his heart. However, developers who worked on other titles and with other studios helped him out. This, combined with messages of support from other people around the world, led to him changing the story in Hyper Light Drifter to be about a struggle shared by people outside of the player character as well. In spite of everything Alex was going through, the campaign plugged along with updates happening anywhere from every couple days to every couple months, with the occasional feedback thread, Twitch stream, and preview builds, as well as info on conventions where playable builds would appear, being shared along the way. Hyper Light Drifter released at the end of March 2016, and not without issues. Humble Bundle was supposed to handle key distribution and accidentally sent PC, Mac, or Linux keys to people who wanted console versions. These were rescinded, and those backers eventually got their proper keys in July of that year when the console version launched. Though that was also problematic, as the PS4 keys for some regions were apparently flat out wrong, with Sony Europe eventually fixing that issue. And Sony US didn't deliver the launch day DLC that should have been included initially. Getting past those issues, all I backed for and received was a copy of the game, and it's the total package. Every bit of audio and video complements the other, with its digitized ambient tracks and pixel art and animation loaded with a mix of cool and neon colors. I'm admittedly pretty bad at this game, but even so, I can appreciate the intricacies involved in movement and combat, particularly with how melee and ranged attacks need to play off each other to work most efficiently. It's the kind of game where I die a lot, but with the game's atmosphere, it's hard for me to be frustrated by any of it. To say Hyper Light Drifter was received well is an understatement. It still sits comfortably above an 8 out of 10 on average across all critics, and the year it came out, it received a long list of award nominations from a variety of places, including the Game Awards, DICE Awards, and Golden Joystick Awards. It would end up winning the Audience Award and the Award for Excellence in Art from the Independent Games Festival. Alex and Heart Machine would go on to make another game, Solar Ash, before announcing a direct sequel to Hyper Light Drifter titled Hyper Light Breaker, in addition to an animated series for Hyper Light Drifter under the guidance of Adi Shankar, who previously worked on the Netflix Castlevania series. So what is there to learn from this, if anything? I've highlighted examples of games from experienced developers that bombed and succeeded, and games from less experienced one-man bands that bombed and succeeded. Games with able developers who simply stopped working on their projects, and in one case, a developer who had a good reason to stop working on his project, but went through with it anyway. And games that made way more than their goals, which succeeded and failed, and games that barely hit their funding goals, which succeeded and failed. Even looking back at the math near the beginning of the video, I'm not going to pretend that this is an exact science. Some games were larger or smaller in scope, and for some games I pledged for fewer rewards, making each success or failure unequal to each other. It's also worth noting that a good portion of these projects were from the early to mid-2010s, when the crowdfunding rush for video games was peaking and the idea of crowdfunding campaigns being the equivalent to pre-ordering games was much more prevalent, even as sites like Kickstarter posted blogs and disclaimers saying no, they were not stores and people were not pre-ordering products. The only thing I can suggest for people who are considering backing anything crowdfunding related is the golden rule of investing. Only spend what you are willing to lose. Crowdfunding is much closer to investing than pre-ordering, and much closer to philanthropy than investing. Unless you're doing it through platforms like Fig. While past failures did make me more cautious about who or what I support, it hasn't completely turned me off of crowdfunding. In fact, I backed 2 more projects while I was working on this video. Because I know the risks, and I accept the risks.